Now, I know that episode 1 probably caused a few Dutch people and other Vermeer tragics to spit out their stroopwafels. They would have wondered whether what they saw was real or if they were just being taken for a ride. Well, yes, it was very real, and in this episode I'm going deeper down the rabbit hole to show you some truly remarkable things, and I'm also going to upset the Dutch even more by taking a knife to my little painting with its strange Vermeer-like signature, so we can see if it's actually even old enough to be a real Vermeer. Anyone else out there ever sliced a chunk off of Vermeer? No, I didn't think so. Well, you'd best be sitting down for this episode then. Welcome back to Vermeer's Child. First, let me explain the problem I was left with after the first episode. I had a painting that looked old and appeared to have at least a partial Vermeer signature, although if it was a signature, it had been overpainted. The painting was pretty much identical in composition to a famous painting by Pieter de Hooch, and Vermeer and de Hooch had known each other, so it was theoretically possible for either one of these artists to have copied the other's painting. But for this theory to have any legs at all, my painting had to be old, very old. In fact, it had to fit within a brutally narrow time band. I'm just going to run some numbers by you, and I'm sorry if this is a bit complex, but stick with it because it'll make sense by the end of the episode. Remember that de Hooch's version of this scene was painted sometime in the period 1660 to 1663. Because de Hooch's painting has a known provenance and is in a prestigious collection, you would expect it to be the original from which mine was copied. 1660 was when de Hooch left Delft and moved to Amsterdam, so when he painted it, he and Vermeer were probably in separate cities. So for my painting to be the original version, it had to predate 1660, regardless of who painted it. But for it to have been painted by Vermeer before the de Hooch painting, the window narrows much further. Vermeer's professional career started in the last couple of days of 1653, when he was admitted to the Painters Guild as an independent master. So for him to be the originator of this subject, he had to have painted it in the 6-year period from 1654 to 1659. That's one of 6 years out of the last 369 years. It's a bit like trying to thread a needle from the other side of the room. Vermeer died in 1675, so if de Hooch originated this subject and my painting was painted by Vermeer, he still had 15 years to copy de Hooch's painting after de Hooch had painted it. Still a very narrow window of opportunity, but a bit more generous. And of course, there was the far more likely scenario that it was painted by someone unknown sometime between 1660 and the mid-1960s, when the owners prior to me bought it. That's a 300-year opportunity. So what I want to do now is to take you on a tour of the back of the canvas and to pick out anything that might be important in terms of determining the age or who painted it. The first thing to notice is that this painting hasn't been lined. It actually wobbles a bit like a jelly in the middle, so it's not because it doesn't need lining, it's probably just never fallen into the hands of anyone who could afford it or thought it was necessary. The next thing that's worth having a quick look at are the nails on the painting. They're relatively consistent, but they're all slightly different, so they appear to have been handmade, but they're quite small, and they're fairly sparse as well. There's only on the side of the painting, I think there's about 5 on the long side, and if you have a look at the back of the painting, there's only 1, 2, 3, 4, about 4 or 5 even on the back of it, so on the long dimension, so they're pretty sparse. The next thing I wanted to point out is the colour of the varnish that's coming around the side of the painting, and you can see how really dark it is. So this is what we're looking through when we look at the front of the painting. We're looking through this really tobacco-coloured varnish. The next thing of interest is the actual colour of the canvas itself, and it's been primed in a colour that's either a beige or a dirty grey. It's a bit hard to tell because the painting is so dirty. I think it's probably a beige, and Vermeer apparently painted on both grey and beige canvases in Delft. Now, let's just have a look at the stretches on the painting. The wooden bars on the painting seem to be interchangeably known as either stretchers or strainers, depending on what book you read. I'm going to call them stretchers, and the little corner keys that are nailed in the little wedges, they apparently weren't invented or didn't come into general use until the 18th century, and most canvases have been taken off their original rigid stretchers and put onto this type of stretcher so that it can be expanded. And you can actually see that this one has been expanded on the corners because there's a gap between the vertical and horizontal bars in each corner of about 3 millimetres. And you can also see, if you look at the top of the painting, that it's been displaced about 3 millimetres as well. So this is a painting that's been expanded by these little adjustable corner wedges and pushed outwards. And so it's had about 6 millimetres added to the width and the height by stretching it, I imagine, which seems to be quite an extraordinary amount. And it would lead to a lot of cracking on the front of the painting, which we'll have a look at. The thing that I'm not sure about is whether the original rigid stretcher bars were actually pulled apart and reused with these wedges, because it's quite possible to do that in woodwork. You could easily, if the joint can be dismantled, you could take the whole thing off, knock it apart, and then cut 2 slots for the 2 wedges in each corner and put it back together again. Then the beauty of doing that, of course, is you're expanding it based on the original location of the canvas, which is what you want to do. The other really important feature to notice on this is that it has a selvage at the bottom. Now, selvage is the left or right side of a piece of fabric when it sits on a loom. What happens is that the weaver sets up the warp of the fabric by stretching the long threads first on the loom, and the weft, which is usually the horizontal threads on a very large canvas, go back and forth across the canvas to build up the weave of the fabric. But that's not always the case with small canvases, and it's certainly not the case with this canvas, because the selvage is on the bottom of it, which means that the canvas long dimension actually runs horizontally. So on this one, the warp runs across the canvas and the weft runs vertically. And that's not a any great moment as far as this goes, but it's interesting in terms of being able to actually count the threads. So because quite often you can't work out which one is the warp and which is the weft, but on this one you can. And in terms of the thread count, I've measured it many times and counted it in a number of different areas, and it seems to vary quite a lot across the canvas. So it's not consistent, which apparently is also fairly normal. But at times I've had 15 warp and 15 weft. At times I've had anything up to 17 by 17. So it just depends on where you are and how much that bit of canvas has been stretched. So I'm not going to guarantee, but it's somewhere in the range of 15 to 17 and not necessarily equal. Certainly it does vary at times. So, and in fact, when you get into the corners of the canvas and you have a look at it on the inside, it actually looks even a little bit crushed. It's like as if, I think it might be because of this expansion that's gone on of these little wedges. It sort of actually seems to have flattened or damaged the way the canvas actually looks on the inside. So those, when you get close to a corner, it's just about impossible to count. Now let's have a look at the features of the back of the canvas. As you can see, there's a little bit of a drawing in the top left-hand corner. What it is, I don't know. It looks like some hands reaching down, or a bit of fabric, or maybe something to do with someone's hair. It's really, or it could just be someone cleaning their brush. It's really impossible to tell. And what's interesting, though, is it does seem to extend possibly over onto the stretcher. Now, I'm not sure whether that's part of the same thing or not. It does look like it is, which would indicate that if that was painted by the artist who painted the front of the painting, then this would have been an original rigid stretcher taken off, adapted to be an adjustable stretcher, and then put back on in pretty much the same place, although you can see where there's a couple of nail holes below and some all the fabric has been cut off. Now, you'll notice that there's quite significant damage at the top, and when I got the painting, it was actually nailed onto its frame. So, and the nails were driven flush. There were only 4 of them. There was one halfway down each of the stretches, driven completely flush right down, so you couldn't even see the heads into the frame. And I had to puzzle for a while about how to get those out, and I ended up drilling out holes in the frame to release the ends of the nails and then wiggling them back through. So I managed to do it without damaging it. But the top of it was already pretty badly damaged, because what happened was the wire that ran across the frame intersected exactly with that location at the top, and where the nail had gone through into the stretcher, it obviously had caused some damage, and over the time, I guess, taken on and off walls, it's ripped the top of the canvas, and so it sits sort of loose at that point. As we go across further, you'll see a label, and the label, or remnants of a label at least, and this label is really interesting. It has 2 names on it, one in the top right-hand corner, and one sitting on a little fragment of paper that remains about halfway down. And I think both of those names should be capable of being read, because if they used iron gall ink, then it would leave a residue which probably would soak through and stain both the paper and perhaps even the underside of the top side of the frame. And I imagine that can be read. Also, just below the name at the very top, you'll see that there's what looks like a date. I'm not sure what the date is, but again, that is something that someone might be able to work out. It looks a bit like 1670, but I can't really read it. And about over towards the left at the bottom, there's also what looks like some numbers. And again, I can't work out what that is. It's something with a 3 and something else, but I'm not sure what that is. As we move across the top of the painting and down the right-hand side, there are some pencil marks. Now, there's pencil marks on the stretcher itself and some pencil marks down the right-hand side of the back. One of them says 16 by 20, and of course, given that the painting's been put into a relatively new frame, that could be anything. It could actually be from the original painting, but it could also likely be from when someone wanted to get a frame for it. There's also something that says XO2/6, and I don't know whether that is a price of something or a taxation number or something like that. There's also what appears to be a couple of little tiny drawings on the right-hand side, and I'll just show you what they look like. When we get down to the bottom, you'll see that the painting's been folded over in the bottom corners and nailed flat. Same at the top corners, of course. But when you get to the selvage edge, it's interesting because you can actually see and feel what is a very stiff bit of canvas. And it's canvas at this stage, if it was an old canvas, would have been impregnated with glue before being coated with the chalk that would have filled in all of the grains in the actual weave. And that would have been built up and smoothed down and then coated over with the final top coat of the beige or grey or whatever this is. So it's interesting that you can actually feel and see that probably animal glue that was used. So it certainly looks pretty old. The other thing that's really interesting in the bottom edge is you can see that there are little holes, and they're 40 millimetres apart, quite close to the edge. They're only about a little less than half an inch off the edge, so about 10 millimetres, 12 millimetres, something like that. So that would indicate perhaps that they're the holes where this might have been laced onto a strainer while the canvas itself was actually being prepared. It's hard to say what they are, but if there were no holes in that selvage, it might be a bit suspicious, I think, because there just have to be holes. Otherwise, this has not been a canvas that's been prepared in the traditional way. Now, there's a number of holes around the back of the painting that are in these stretches that have got nothing in them. So something's been removed, and I suspect it's been the canvas. It's been taken off, and then I think it's probably been put back on again and probably cut down when that happened. You can see on the middle of the back it's got some chalk marks as well. It says 1 and a slash and then 8-1 something or other, or depending on which side is the right side up. But anyway, there's some chalk marks on the back of it. In the very bottom centre stretcher, there's a label from Lever Gallery in Bournemouth in the UK. So that's pretty interesting. Their telephone number at the time only had 3 digits, so it's a pretty old label. The most important thing to note about this canvas is that it has cusping on all 4 sides. Now, cusping are arcs formed in the canvas itself when it's laced onto those strainers that I've talked about and then waterproofed and filled with filling material. That gets locked into the canvas, and of course it remains there for the whole time. So when you turn the canvases over of this age, they'll all have cusping on at least 2 of the sides, or perhaps even 4 sides. Depends on how big a piece of canvas was prepared at the one time and whether they were sort of cut into multiple canvases for painting on. But this one, it has cusping on 4 sides. It has a lot of cusping on the top and the bottom and less cusping on the long dimension. So after examining the back in detail, it looked like the canvas was of the right age. It looked like it had been prepared in the right way. The one thing that was a bit anomalous was this business of the corner wedges, and a couple of articles I'd read indicated that these didn't come in until the next century, and a couple that I'd read, even one as recently as yesterday, where a person claimed that the Claude Lorraine painting was on its original stretches. Certainly when you look at the picture of the stretches, it's got corner wedges. So, I mean, I don't know whether this lack of precision is normal in the art world, but it certainly was frustrating to me. So what I didn't like was having even a small amount of doubt about the age, because it could have been painted in the late 1600s, very late 1600s, long after Vermeer's death, or it could have been painted in the early 1700s. There was just no way of being absolutely certain. I puzzled over this for quite some time, and I had a bit of luck one evening when I was having a glass of wine. I was reading some articles online, and I found an article about a painting that had been carbon dated in Australia. It was done by Australia's only nuclear facility, the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation over in New South Wales. So I sent them an email asking if they'd be interested in having a crack at carbon dating the canvas, and they sent a reply pretty quickly saying that they'd be happy to. So the problem was, of course, that they needed a piece of the canvas, and we had to decide how much and where it should come from. After a bit of toing and froing, there were two little areas that I identified and gave them a choice of either of them, because they didn't seem to matter to the actual rest of the canvas. And they wanted the larger of the two, which I was perfectly happy to provide. So I cut it off and put it in an envelope and sent it over to them. Of course, we were all still locked down at that time, and so I sat and waited for some time. I don't know how lockdown was affecting them. I suppose scientists were still able to continue their work. But a couple of months later, virtually on Christmas Eve of 2020, I got the reply. And the gist of it is that while there are 4 possible date ranges that the painting could fall into, the earliest carbon that comes up on the calibration curve that was applied, and the calibration curve relates to the Northern Hemisphere, because I told them it was probably from Northern Europe, Holland, and so they applied the appropriate calibration curve, and the earliest intersection of the date was 1666, and that was a calibration intersection that has a 95% potential accuracy rate, so a few percentage either way, of course, and it would take in the whole of Vermeer's painting career. So it appeared that I'd absolutely hit the target in terms of the potential for this painting to have come from that period. So the carbon dating gave me a lot of confidence that this was a canvas, at least, that was from the right period. About a year and a half after I received that result, I was starting to assemble all the videos that I'd ever taken and all the photographs I'd ever taken of this painting, and there's literally thousands of them. I've probably spent more time looking at this painting than anyone's ever looked at a painting in their life. And I've taken, tens of thousands of photographs and videos and everything of it. And I was going through some of the very earliest ones that I'd actually taken, but right back in the early days when I was puzzled by this mark that looked like an M, I took some photos that were virtually in the dark, because I decided at that time that when you're in the dark, it seemed to, for some reason, show up a little bit better, or very, very dim light. Obviously in the dark you couldn't see it at all, but I mean in very, very low light. Anyway, there was a photograph there that I found that I'd ignored, and when I looked back at it, I was absolutely stunned, because it appears to be a date. So within the M, these numbers appear, and it explains the little bump that was on the top of the M that I could never quite work out why there was a little bump there, and I think it's the top curve of the number 6. The first one on the left is obviously the 1, a 6, and then there's quite a clear 5, 5. I suppose it's possible that these could be some sort of coincidental marks, but it seems very extraordinary to me that within the middle of an M that was a little bit unusual, because it seemed to have a slightly different shape. It was slightly more splayed out. There is written what appears to be 1655. I think it's intentional, but obviously it's a matter that experts would have to have a look at and decide whether that's the case. But it seems to me, and when we get to the rest of the painting, we actually see other things that are concealed within this painting, that this was someone who was playing around with an idea of things that would appear in certain light and not appear in others. And I think that it is an M, and I think that it is also comprised of a date that's hidden within it. But you have a look at it and you decide what you think. But I think it reads 1655. And 1655 for this painting would completely change art history, because it would mean that this painting was the original painting and de Hooch's painting was a copy. And in the next episode, while I wouldn't mind jumping immediately to having a look at the two paintings in detail to see if I can find anything that lends weight to this theory, I think it's actually more important to have a look at the front of this painting in terms of its actual condition, and just to make sure that the surface of the painting is consistent with the painting that's been around for that period of time. In other words, just to make sure that someone hasn't picked up an old canvas and then scrubbed off a painting that was there and knocked up a forgery on top of an old canvas. Now, obviously, you'd have to be lucky, Pierre, to find a canvas that's from exactly the right period, but it's possible, I guess. So let's have a look at that in the next episode, and then we'll go on to actually compare the two paintings, and then we'll start to get into the nitty-gritty of having a look at the small painting in a lot of detail. So I hope you'll come back for the third episode. I'm sorry that this one has been a bit long. All the rest of them, I hopefully, will be a lot shorter. Please subscribe and give it a thumbs up if you haven't, and we'll get on to the rest of the story because it's pretty interesting from here on. Thank you.